Let's break down the top waiver wire additions heading into week 11 of 2024 fantasy football. And before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with the promo code catch a free NFL pick'em to use towards Monday Night Football. And don't worry, if you watch this video later in the week, you'll get a free NFL pick'em to use towards Week 11's action. And on top of that, Underdog is also giving all new users who sign up with promo code catch a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free NFL pick'em to use towards this week's action, and up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog when you sign up with promo code catch. That link is down below. All right, so let's kick the video off with Marquez Valdes-Scantling of the New Orleans Saints. Wow. I had very little faith in the Saints wide receivers room moving into week 10, I will admit. And while there's much speculation around who could be the potential primary pass catcher here for the Saints, if it wasn't Alvin Kamara or Taysom Hill, it turned out to be MVS, who sits at 2% rostered. Now, very low volume here, some big splash plays for MVS in this game. 2 touchdowns, obviously, off of 3 targets, 3 receptions, 109 receiving yards, 25.9 fantasy points. So we do want to be a little bit careful here. We've seen this story before with numerous players, right? Got to be careful chasing points, but I mean, he sits at 2% rostered. There's very low risk here, and he's got a strong matchup against the Cleveland Browns in Week 11. So I'm willing to take the gamble here. After the bye week in Week 12 for the Saints, the Rams, and the Giants in the next 2 weeks. So a pretty strong strength of schedule. Don't exactly know what the Saints are playing for at this point in their season, but nonetheless, if MVS is going to be the player who's going to see volume at the wide receiver position, we want to go out and take a swing on him. We look at the rest of this roster: Mason Tipton, Dante Pettis, Cedric Wilson, who's injured, Jermaine Jackson, Kevin Austin. I mean, it's not very good, to say the least. So MVS, some nice veteran experience, made some big plays in that Week 10 matchup against Atlanta. Don't get too crazy here, but he is certainly an option who sits at a very low roster percentage that we can add going into Week 11. All right, we have talked a lot about Quentin Johnston in the past couple weeks, who sits at 59% rostered, and I thought he was going to have a bigger game in Week 10 than he had. 10.4 fantasy points, just 2 targets, 2 catches, 24 receiving yards, and a touchdown. He scored that touchdown pretty early in the game, so I was expecting a higher ceiling here, but we've been talking about QJ as a player to add for quite a few weeks now, and I keep reminding you guys early in the season, you know, he had that great red zone chemistry with Justin Herbert with 3 touchdowns through the first 3 games of the season, and we've really seen that kind of come back to fruition in the past 2 weeks against the Browns and the Titans with 2 touchdowns in the last 2 weeks, 22 fantasy points in Week 9, then 10.4 fantasy points this past week. Like I said, sits at 59% roster. Not entirely sure that you're going to be able to just run out to the waiver wire and grab him, but if he's out there and available, I do think he's a top priority add. We get the Cincinnati Bengals in Week 11, and a great matchup against the Baltimore Ravens, and another pretty solid matchup against the Atlanta Falcons in Week 13. So next 3 matchups look pretty solid from a game script perspective. And the Chargers are just throwing the football more, which is something we've talked a lot about in the past 2 weeks. I know, you know, in Week 10, they didn't really need to throw the football as much against the Titans, just 164 passing yards. But ultimately, Justin Herbert has looked really good. This offense has looked a little bit more complete with that passing element kind of added back in, as opposed to how one-dimensional they were kind of towards the beginning of the season. So overall, Quentin Johnston, 59% rostered. I do think he should be rostered in more leagues. He's going to be a player who can be a viable flex option at the wide receiver position as we continue here in the 2024 season. All right, next up, let's talk about the Niners wide receivers. Let's start with Jawan Jennings, sitting at 69% rostered. So once again, this is probably the highest rostered player that we'll talk about today, but we talked a lot about Jennings going into Week 10. Love the matchup against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He ended up being the leading wide receiver in Week 10 for the Niners. 11 targets, 7 catches, 93 receiving yards, and 16.3 fantasy points. So if he's out there and available in your league, I definitely think he's worth adding. We have the return of CMC. We still have Kittle, very relevant in this offense. Deebo Samuel was healthy and played in week 10. And we're going to talk about Ricky Pearsall in a second here, but, he obviously had a good game as well. But Jennings is still worth adding. Now, we're not going to be looking at the Niners playing a weak secondary like the Tampa Bay Buccaneers every single week, but the Niners trying to win this division and trying to go on a little bit of a very nice stretch in terms of an actual healthy offense to wrap up this season here. So they get Seattle in week 11. I'm good with that matchup. Then 2 good game scripts between the Packers and the Bills in weeks 12 and 13. So Jennings, I know he's a little bit higher roster, but if he's out there and available, he is a priority add for you going into week 11. All right, and like I said, we're going to take a look at Ricky Pearsall as well, who's also pretty highly rostered at 55% rostered, but still available in plenty of leagues, I'm sure. He had 17.3 fantasy points in week 10, scoring his first career touchdowns, 6 targets, 4 receptions, 73 receiving yards in week 10 on top of that touchdown. So same idea here. This Niners offense going to keep rolling here, healthy, going to be in a lot of good game scripts, trying to get as many wins here as they wrap up this final stretch of the season. I can't believe we only have 2 months left of football, essentially, but the Niners trying to win that division, still a very relevant offense. Kind of a weird start to the season, but like I said, now that they can get healthy, we're going to see more and more of these games get rolling, and I think the best thing for Ricky Pearsall is the fact that all these other playmakers are out there on the field, and there's such little defensive pressure when it comes to Ricky Pearsall because CMC, Kittle, Deebo, Jawan Jennings all have to be accounted for. So Pearsall's out there and available. Even if you're not starting him right off the gate, he is definitely a roster-worthy player that needs to be rostered in a higher percentage of leagues as we get into week 11. All right, next up, I want to talk about Cedric Tillman of the Cleveland Browns. And I would honestly take a look to see if any of the Browns wide receivers are available in your league, whether it's Tillman, Judy, who sits at 62% rostered, or Elijah Moore, who sits at 17% rostered. But the player with the most upside, in my opinion, out of the bunch is Cedric Tillman, who is the most highly rostered player, sitting at 68% rostered. But the Browns are on bye week in week 10, so especially if you're in a league where you have like 4 bench spots, less bench spots than other leagues, you might want to go check if Cedric Tillman got dropped due to the bye week, because if he's out there floating around, he's a nice high upside flex option that we can continue to roll with as the season progresses. Looking back to week 9, bad game for the Browns against the Chargers, but Tillman had 11 targets, 6 grabs, 75 receiving yards, and that kind of garbage time touchdown. But this is still the player who's going to make those big time plays out of this wide receiver bunch, in my opinion. So just go out and check. The Browns play the Saints in week 11, who look better in week 10 than previous weeks, but are still the Saints. And it is kind of a tough stretch here for the Browns. The Saints, the Steelers, the Broncos, the Steelers, the Chiefs. That's a pretty tough stretch, but there's always garbage time, and they're probably going to be playing from behind. So just go out and check. If Tillman is out there and available, he definitely needs to be rostered going into week 11. I want to quickly mention Demarcus Robinson, who is off of the injury report going into week 10's matchup on Monday Night Football against the Miami Dolphins. Now, I'm not exactly expecting a monster game out of Robinson. It could happen, sure. But Miami's been pretty good against opposing wide receivers thus far on the season. But Robinson, because he kind of held that injury designation throughout the week, may have ended up being a player who got dropped. If he's out there and available, I still think he's going to be a player, even if week 10 isn't the best week for him, who can be a viable flex option as the season progresses. A little bit volatile, don't get me wrong, but I still think he's going to be a player that brings upside to the table. So a player that should be rostered. To me, this is still the clear-cut wide receiver 3 on the Rams behind Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua. So we'll see how Monday Night Football goes. Maybe it'll change your perspective here. But the Patriots in week 11, the Eagles in week 12, the Saints in week 13. Not the greatest, not the worst matchups here coming up, but the Rams, another one of these teams, now that they're healthy, trying to go on a little bit of a tear here, get as many wins racked up as possible, and try and make a playoff run. So Robinson sitting at 48% rostered. He's out there and available as you make your waiver decisions going into week 11. Regardless of what happens in Monday Night Football, I think he's a strong add as we get into week 11. All right, last wide receiver that I want to go over is Mike Williams, now of the Pittsburgh Steelers, sitting at 20% rostered. So don't get me wrong here. 1 target, 1 catch. It was a 32-yard receiving touchdown, 10.2 fantasy points. We want to be very careful here. Don't want to chase points, especially when the volume is 1 target, 1 catch, right? But the next 2 weeks, 2 very strong matchups against the Baltimore Ravens and the Cleveland Browns, 2 teams that have really struggled against opposing wide receivers thus far on the season. And I do think that there's a world where Mike Williams continues to be a part of the game plan and has these kind of big plays drawn up for him. Don't want to get too excited here, but he sits at just 20% rostered. You know, if you have a player that is just worthless that you're able to drop, if it's thin out there, whatever, you're in a deeper league, I think Mike Williams, we can take the risk here. I told you guys going into week 10, keep an eye on Calvin Austin, keep an eye on Van Jefferson. And Van Jefferson was hardly on the field, just 2 total targets. Calvin Austin had 6 targets, 2 grabs. And the reason being is that the Steelers offense has just slowly continued to open up with Russell Wilson at quarterback, which we'll continue to talk about later in the video. But it turned out to be, I guess, Mike Williams, who was the winner this week. So we could see some variation there. I mean, in earlier weeks also, we had seen, Van Jefferson had 10 fantasy points in week 8. Calvin Austin had 20.4 in week 8. So let's continue to keep an eye on these Steelers wide receivers outside of George Pickens. But at the moment, the guy I take a risk on, I guess, is Mike Williams as we move in to week 11. Moving along to the tight end position, I just very quickly want to mention Dallas Goedert, who does sit at 78% rostered, because, he was injured for the previous 4 weeks going into week 10. And you might be surprised. He might be available in your league. I was looking through all of my leagues, and I am in almost 20 leagues, but I was surprised to see how often Dallas Goedert was sitting out there and available. He did kind of carry an injury tag for most of the week, so I think maybe that spooked some fantasy managers. They went in a different direction, whatever. But if he's out there and available, he's got to be a top priority add. Just 3 targets in week 10 against Dallas, but 2 grabs, 25 receiving yards, and a touchdown, 10.5 fantasy points. So, you look back to earlier on the season, 6.8 or more fantasy points through his first 4 games, 13.2 or more, and 2 of those games with a ceiling of 27 fantasy points. So Goddard's still going to be one of these guys that we can throw in, roll with the punches. We know what the ceiling is. He has touchdown upside. You can't be much worse than most of the tight ends out there. So obviously a part of a good offense with the Eagles and everything. So if Goedert is available, he is definitely a priority add as we move into the week, and he might just be available due to the injury leading up to week 10. Let's talk about Pat Freiermuth of the Pittsburgh Steelers, who showed up very nicely in week 10 against the Washington Commanders. 3 targets, 3 grabs, 17 receiving yards, and a touchdown. So listen, Freiermuth has been kind of up and down on the season, has had a pretty low ceiling, but he has had these games when he does score a touchdown where he's essentially getting you double digits every time he scores a touchdown. 16.7 fantasy points in week 4 against the Colts, 9.2 in week 5 where he did score a touchdown, but he also had a fumble, so that took him under double digits, but close. Then this past week, 10.7 fantasy points while scoring a touchdown. But the Steelers offense continuing just to open up, looks better and better. The passing attack looks better. They play the Ravens in week 11, who have really struggled against the tight end position thus far on the season. One of the worst teams in terms of fantasy points allowed to the tight end position. So if you need a streaming option at the tight end position due to bye weeks or whatever, going into week 11, I know Freiermuth still sits at 51% rostered, but he's at least a player that we can roll with, kind of take the punches and look for that upside and hope that it's there when he does score those touchdowns. And regardless, if you're in a bind here in week 11 and he's available, it is a great matchup against the Baltimore Ravens. All right, last time that I mentioned a Pittsburgh Steeler in today's video, let's move along to quarterbacks, and that is going to be, of course, Russell Wilson of the Pittsburgh Steelers. 19.1 fantasy points in week 10, was 14 of 28 for 195 passing yards. Not stellar, but he did have 3 passing touchdowns and 1 interception. But ultimately, I mean, you guys know that going back to the previous weeks, I've been talking about Russell Wilson for some time now. I mean, I talked about picking him up before week 7's matchup against the Jets when he had 24 fantasy points, 2 passing touchdowns and a rushing touchdown. Then you can look at week 8, just 13 fantasy points, but he basically threw 2 touchdowns in that game that got called back, right? So he should have had a much better fantasy stat line. Regardless, Russell Wilson, I think, is a player that, for the most part, especially in double quarterback superflex leagues, needs to be rostered. I mean, we can really at this point trust Russell Wilson for the continuation of the season. I don't think there's any reason not to. He's proven enough at this point. 19 or more fantasy points in 2 out of his 3 starts. And then, I mean, let's just say he threw, one of those touchdowns didn't get called back in week 8. He would still have been around 18 or 19 fantasy points. So pretty safe floor. The ceiling around 24 fantasy points. Good matchup against the Ravens in week 11. Good matchup against the Browns in week 12. The Steelers are going to continue to try and rack up as many wins as possible and continue for that strong playoff push. They got a lot of nice competitive matchups coming up. Russell Wilson sits at just 28% rostered. If you need help at the quarterback position, I think he is a priority add as we move in to week 11. All right, next up at the quarterback position is Bo Nix of the Denver Broncos, who we have talked about plenty on the channel throughout the course of the season. Your QB 8 going into week 10 and just 16.1 fantasy points, nothing crazy. But I think the most promising thing was against that Chiefs defense on the road, and Arrowhead had a pretty dang stable game. 22 of 30, 215 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns. Wasn't great on the ground by any stretch, -5 rushing yards, and then had the fumble that wasn't a lost fumble, but still ultimately a good, clean game for the most part. If you took away the fumble, he would have been around 18 fantasy points. So gets the Atlanta Falcons in week 11. I like that matchup. Then the Raiders and the Browns before the week 14 bye week. So Bo Nix, just one of these players, 44% rostered. We know the ceiling, 29 fantasy points. We know that the floor is pretty safe. It's been safe since week 5. And you go back even to week 3, we only have 1 or 2 games, I should say. I mean, against the Jets and against the Saints, where he's scored under 16 fantasy points. So good floor, nice ceiling, has had a very good rookie season that's kind of going under the radar with the success of Jaden Daniels and the polarization of Caleb Williams, I guess. But Bo Nix has been solid. So if he's out there and available, you need help at quarterback. At this point, I think Bo Nix is 100% worth rostering. And we've talked about him for weeks now as being a good option. And I think that definitely will continue going in to week 11. Last quarterback I want to mention is Justin Herbert, who comes in at 55% rostered. And at this point, I think Herbert just deserves to be picked up. I was very low on Herbert going into the season, was very low on Herbert at the beginning of the season. I don't think we really called Herbert a start until like week 9 and the start sit videos. But here we are with 3 straight weeks of 19 or more fantasy points. We went over this a little bit earlier talking about Quinn Johnson, but 14 of 18, 164 passing yards in week 10, a passing touchdown, 32 yards on the ground, looked pretty good on the ground, and a rushing touchdown. So 19 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games with a ceiling of 24 fantasy points. Gets the Bengals this week, then the Ravens, then the Falcons. I like this stretch. You need help at quarterback. The Chargers are starting to throw the football a lot more, look a lot more balanced. Quinn Johnson's looked good. Ladd McConkey has looked good. Josh Palmer's been involved, wasn't crazy involved this past week, but Will Dissly's looked okay. And now we got Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins getting touches. This Chargers team continuing to make a push for the playoffs. I like Justin Herbert quite a bit right now. A little bit higher rostered, but if you need help at quarterback and he's available, I think he is a strong option moving forward here in week 11. I'm not going to break down each of these running backs too extensively here, but here's a list of just handcuff running backs that you guys can take a look at as we move into the final stretch of the fantasy season. Guys that should be available for the most part in your league that I think are strong handcuffs to pick up and stash if anything were to happen to the starting running back on their respective team. Now, I will note that Audric Estime is not really a handcuff, but maybe could be. I mean, we had Sean Payton come out and say that he was going to get more touches. And then, interesting, Javonte Williams, 1 touch this past week, then 2 targets, 2 grabs. Jaleel McLaughlin, 2 touches on the ground compared to Estime's 14 touches. So, I mean, I don't know if I trust a Sean Payton backfield. I don't quite know if it'll look this way next week, but he's not a handcuff, I guess, because he led the backfield in terms of touches this past week. So he's an interesting ad for sure, getting the Atlanta Falcons a good run defense in week 11. But nonetheless, Ray Davis, Justice Hill, Tyler Algier, Emmanuel Wilson, Jalen Warren, Gus Bus, Trey Benson, all options here. And yeah, I will say that Gus Edwards getting involved is also interesting to me. Obviously, he had been on IR for a few weeks and is back. He had 10 touches for 55 yards, 5.5 yards per carry in week 10 against the Tennessee Titans. So if you're a J.K. Dobbins owner, you're like, whoa, what's going on here? But Dobbins still had 15 touches and 3 targets, 3 receptions, and 50 rushing yards on the ground. So still J.K. Dobbins backfield, but now we're getting a little bit of a 1B situation with Gus Edwards. So interesting to note. But everyone else here essentially handcuffs. Jaylen Warren has some standalone value. Any of these guys could have standalone value on a weekly basis. So as we move into the final stretch of the season, try and handcuff some of your starting running backs, or if you just have a roster spot that you think is kind of pointless, go ahead and drop a player and try and handcuff a running back as we get into week 11. That'll do it for today's video. There are your priority waiver wire ads moving into week 11 of the 2024 fantasy football season. As always, guys, I will answer every single comment on this video. So if you guys need anything whatsoever moving into week 11 of the 2024 fantasy football season, be sure to drop me a comment and I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can. But more importantly, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel, because we're going to have every single thing that you could possibly need to help you dominate week 11 of 2024 fantasy football as the week progresses. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.